Good. Oh, it's fine. The men. Well, welcome back to our second panel discussion of this morning. This second panel, now that we've solved the data issue with the first panel discussion, we are moving into a second issue to discuss and to solve, hopefully. No pressure on the speakers. The second discussion is on evidence-based policy making in a rapidly changing world. My name is Céline Kaufmann. I'm from the OECD Secretariat. And we are going to have a session which is, in effect, discussing how to adapt the toolkit of regulatory policy tools that we have to the new changing world, in particular focusing on regulatory impact assessment and ex-post evaluation. And how can we make those tools helpful for policymakers to deal with the new environment, or if not new environment, the very dynamic technological environment that they're facing. Should we keep them as they are? Should we change them? Is it a complete revolution that we need, or is it only tweaks at the margin? And for this discussion, we have a very good and expert panel around me, but also connecting remotely. We have with me on the stage Daniel Trenka from the OECD Secretariat. I'm not sure that I need to introduce Daniel anymore, but for those of you who don't know Daniel, he's our guru of the best practice principle on regulatory impact assessment, among other things. Surrounding him, we also have two very important speakers who are going to react to the discussion of this morning. To my left, we have Professor Siri from the Norwegian School of Economics. Siri, you're also on the board of the Norwegian Better Regulation Council. And we also have Philip Epler from the UK Regulatory Policy Committee. So as you can see, we have actual practitioners of what evidence-based policy or rulemaking means, in effect, as you are both looking very concretely into the evidence that is coming to you as part of the regulatory impact assessment processes. And I'm sure you're like me, you're very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say on the topic. But before that, let us go to a presentation by Andrea Renda from the CEPS. Most of you know already Andrea Renda. Unfortunately, Andrea couldn't be with us today, so he's used the new technologies to the extent that he could himself disappear, or more precisely appear on the screen for a presentation on the topic, and then we'll come back to the panelists for the discussion. So I'll trust that the technology will work and that the video will appear.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrea Renda, and I'm a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, as well as a professor of digital innovation at the College of Europe. And as you might have realized, I'm not physically present today, but I am very happy to be able to contribute, although virtually, to this very timely gathering on evidence-based policymaking in a rapidly changing world. So I thank the organizers and the OECD for giving me this opportunity to contribute, although from a distance. What I will do in this presentation is to draw on a stream of research that I developed over many years, and in particular also very recently in a paper that I have written together with the OECD Regulatory Policy Committee on the challenges created by the digital transition for regulators. But I will try to give a very quick account of that research that I invite you to, of course, consult. There will be a paper published soon by the OECD on this topic. And then move on towards in exploration of how better regulation might change as a result, or needs to change as a result of the challenges posed by digital technology. to the changing technologies and business models that the digitization of the regulated subject matter typically features. At the same time, at the other end of the spectrum, self-regulation and co-regulation also create problems because there are elements and features in the digital economy that escape the control of regulators in many respects. And this is very easily found in a number of fields in which enforcement is even delegated to private governance. Think about fake news, think about hate speech, think about copyright enforcement, in a way that is quite ironic, because the same online platforms and digital intermediaries that are sometimes demonized, or at least under the spotlight for the need for further regulation and the need for enhanced duty of care when delivering their services, are the same that are then tasked with delicate, let's say, phases of the regulatory governance cycle, such as monitoring of compliance, application of legal rules, and enforcement. So enforcement is also a big challenge for policymakers. And the online environment and also institutions are increasingly facing a trust problem, which is to some extent also dependent on this fact, on the fact that legal rules are hardly effective and the online environment is evolving in a way that has escaped the control of many policymakers. This further reverberates on the monitoring and evaluation function of the regulatory governance cycle. It's very difficult to monitor the impact of legal rules because compliance rates are sometimes very difficult to detect. And also it is very difficult to evaluate the impact of legal rules because of the many factors that are jointly causing the behaviors and the outcomes that we observe on the market. So all those challenges are require a very, let's say, important reform of better regulation tools, or a modernization of better regulation tools. So I will try to explain in the next slides. There are also key opportunities that I think should be reaped by policymakers. The opportunity to move away from the exclusive reliance on things like the standard cost model or calculation of compliance costs and the introduction of burden reduction targets, for example, to embrace technologically enabled solutions that lead to way more drastic reductions of red tape. And this requires the setting up of exchange mechanisms, in particular data exchanges between the regulated entities and the regulators. And it requires building trust in the system, of course, because it is true that being able to observe directly through automatic exchange of data would lead to, if you wish, even 100% reductions in red tape. But this also means that information from the regulated entities immediately is conveyed to regulators, which of course poses confidentiality as well as data protection problems. Now, if this is done, and if this is well conceived and designed, there will be an opportunity to limiting the current delegation of key phases of the regulatory governance cycle to private players, including enforcement, of course. And it would be also a new way of designing regulation and the subsequent functions of the regulatory governance cycle that is more effective and more efficient over time. There's also an opportunity to reconcile the precaution in admitting to market new products and services that are not being tested, and the effects on of which are still unknown, especially for what concerns end users and consumers, with the needs to enable innovation. And the experimental policy making is a growing body of knowledge and a menu of tools for policymakers that indeed need to be explored in depth and approached with due care. So what I've done here is to take one of the many schemes for the policy cycle that are available. This is the European Commission's one. You see there an outer cycle, which are the key phases of the life of a legal rule: the preparation phase or agenda setting phase, the adoption phase, the implementation phase, and the application of the rules that then leads to if there is a need to the preparation of new rules and the revision of legislation. You have an inner cycle, which is better regulation tools, so ex-ante impact assessment, monitoring, and ex-post evaluation. And there is an even core, which is the yellow area, which is a constant dialogue with stakeholders, which is considered to be one of the key preconditions, together with oversight and coordination, for the quality of the legal rules and the overall regulatory framework writ large. Now, based on that scheme, technology is bringing in a number of possibilities. So, well, the first one is an expansion of the potential policy alternatives that a regulator can avail of when trying to address a regulatory problem or trying to achieve an objective through regulation. And I'll be expanding briefly on this in the next slides. There is a need to make regulation more principles-based and more outcome-based, meaning relying more on principles to make regulation more flexible in the adherence to those principles, but also setting specific targets or outcomes that policies are likely to achieve, and leave the flexibility in the middle, and use that flexibility also in experimenting with new regulations. So things like regulatory sandboxes, but also many other potential variants of experimental regulation will become increasingly important in this space in order to, as I was saying before, reconcile the needs of innovation with those of precaution. There is also an enhanced need for using data in regulation. So having data management and collection, storage, and reuse plans when regulators craft new rules is essential, because those data will be used then in the monitoring and evaluation phase, in the revision phase, but also potentially to develop additional services and for reuse in other policy evaluations for different policy measures. There's also the possibility of using AI and machine learning as foundational elements of secondary legislation as ways to make regulation more effective. Importantly, there will be an increased need to establish secure data exchanges in a number of regulated fields between the regulated entities and the regulators, so between business and governments. That's why I use the B2G acronym there. There are countless new possibilities for agile policy making. Consider, for example, the emerging policy strategies on AI, and in particular the ethical principles on AI, something that keeps me very busy these days as I'm contributing to writing the EU and also the Italian strategy on AI as I am speaking. The reliance on standards becomes very complicated in fields that are very quickly evolving. So in some cases you might want to use more agile solutions, such as having websites where good practices and emerging practices that are considered to be adherent to principles and compliant with specific requirements are posted, and they are considered to be an evolving body of knowledge that inspires the market as to which practices are more likely to be considered compliant with the requirements and the principles that are embedded in the legal rules. In the monitoring and evaluation phases, the data exchanges also take a specific form, which is the automatic exchange of data for supervision and regulatory compliance purposes. Especially in the financial sector, this is something that is already established knowledge, so-called SupTech and RegTech. This will soon be used, at least this is what I envisage, in many other markets, from transportation to healthcare to many others. In the application phase, there is a possibility to enhance enforcement possibility by using AI. Things like predictive policing, support to adjudication in courts provided by AI and machine learning systems, with due caveats. But these things are have the potential to increase the effectiveness, efficiency, and the timeliness of the resolution of controversies, for example. In the application part, there is also, in my opinion, the need to develop additional knowledge and additional tools to track the impact of legal rules on the behavior of the end users. So behavioral insights teams, the nudging, let's say, stream of research that was kickstarted by the work of Kahneman and Tversky, and then later Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, and now faces the problem of tools, digital tools that are exponentially more powerful in triggering tiny changes and micromanaging end user behavior and expectations. And this is something that requires an addition of another chapter in our better regulation guidances. In terms of the better regulation tools themselves, I see ex ante impact assessment having to evolve while evidence-based policymaking remains important. Anticipatory policymaking and so-called foresight policymaking is equally important because of the speed of technology evolution. So risks, changes in technologies, upgrades, and revolutions in the business models have to be anticipated. And only by establishing continuous communication with stakeholders and with the research and innovation community, this can actually be done. Now, this has the additional value of being able to providing inputs into the policymaking process that are not just related to assessing the impacts of new rules on innovation, but actually regulating because of the need to accommodate for innovations. And I'll be coming back to this as I wrap up this presentation. Now, in the later phase of monitoring and evaluation, detecting patterns of compliance, detecting correlations between the different phenomena and the outcomes and impacts of the legal rules will be something that will be enormously facilitated by the use of data analytics and AI, in particular deep learning, machine learning, reinforcement learning techniques. And this is something that has to be built from scratch in most of the regulatory authorities, and it's a body of knowledge that will need to be developed over time. And finally, in stakeholder consultation, the processing of input through machine learning is something that has been trialed by a number of institutions, and it's extremely powerful and can retrieve results of public consultation, even large-scale public consultations in a much shorter time, thereby facilitating dialogue with stakeholders as well. Now, in terms of the new policy alternatives, found by doing things in a centralized way, in a distributed way, or in a purely decentralized way. And today, if we look at, for example, the governance of energy grids, as opposed to the future of transportation, or as opposed to smart cities, we see that many of the solutions, many of the alternative policy options increasingly are based and are grounded in these three major ways of approaching governance. So I think that is another thing that where better regulation will need to develop tools. More generally, when it comes to what is sometimes called regulatory engineering, but more generally, the tools and the concepts that we will find in the textbooks on better regulation, I will see these terms, the new screens of regulatory policy options, to emerge that are completely different from what we were used to work with in better regulation a few years ago. The openness and technological neutrality of solutions, the interoperability of potential technological solutions, their scalability, their future contestability for competition purposes, their resilience in terms of security, their enforceability in terms of sustainable imposition and introduction of those rules, the accountability of players in the online world for the data they use, the way they process them, their results and their impacts on society, or their outcomes in terms of how, for example, algorithms interact with society, will be increasingly important, and screens to be applied in policy making, but also things like the establishment of trusted spaces and even use of trustless systems in policy making will become part of the vocabulary of policymakers in the next 5 to 10 years. So the same applies to experiments. It's not just sandboxes. There's a lot more, and there's a lot to study there in terms of how to design those experiments, how to implement them. The idea of regulating, for example, via browser extensions or third-party extensions is something that becomes extremely attractive in the online world, and in all those markets that are being increasingly permeated by the online world. There's also countless space for core regulatory schemes and experimental forms such as auditing, monitoring algorithms, and establishing data spaces with differential access to data that preserves personal data of the end users. To wrap up, technological developments have to be embraced by policymakers. It's a need because policymaking will be overwhelmed by the digital economy very soon. It has to be handled with care, not with fear, but it has to be handled with care. The traditional tools will remain important and essential, but will not be sufficient. There's an urge for policymakers to embrace technology, to expand the possibility frontier, expand the menu of possible options, both in the agenda setting, but also in the application and enforcement of legal rules, and as well as in the better regulation tools of monitoring evaluation in particular. Regulation has to become, as I said already a couple of times, less prescriptive, more principles-based, more outcomes-based, both evidence and foresight-based, and overall more agile. Innovation, as I already mentioned, should not be an input, should be an input and an outcome of the regulatory process. It should not be merely an afterthought in crafting legislation. The boundaries between ex-ante impact assessment and ex-post evaluation are likely to blur over time. In principle, experimentation could be an ongoing activity of the policymakers, as well as anticipatory policymaking, but with a caveat that this cannot transform the better regulation agenda into a continuous monitoring as opposed to an ex-ante and an ex-post phase. And the reason is, my last bullet point, the fact that regardless of how agile this instrument will become, regulatory stability and certainty is extremely important. So the key challenge of for regulators in the years to come will indeed be that of finding and striking the right balance between ensuring flexibility, ensuring innovation, accommodating new technological solutions and business models, but at the same time providing regulatory certainty and stability to all the actors in this space. I'll finish here and thank you for your attention. Apologies again for not being able to participate in person today, and I'm happy to keep this conversation going, and wish you a very fruitful continuation of your day. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, wherever you are. I'm sure you will have a lot of reactions to that presentation. As usual, Andrea is being very provocative, and you'll have an opportunity to do so. So let me tell you a bit about the scenario for this session. We have more or less an hour for the panel discussion and the interaction with you. And then I want to leave a bit of time for Janine at the end to wrap up the morning discussion. So more or less in 1 hour, Janine will be back to the stage to give us our feedback on the two sessions we've had this morning. But to trigger that discussion of the second panel discussion, let me give the floor to Daniel to give an overview of the OECD perspective on where we're going with the RIA and ex-post evaluation tools.
Well, thank you very much, Celine. I will stand up because so I can see the screen, because I don't know the rest presentation from by heart. But let me just first set the scene. And there are two reasons for that. First one is that we have many participants from Norway who are not part of the Regulatory Policy Committee, so maybe they don't know so much about our work. We would like to advertise as well. And the other reason is that we are talking about traditional regulatory management tools. But what do we actually mean by that? Well, we are mostly talking about regulatory impact assessment, ex-post reviews of regulations, and also stakeholder engagement. And right now, actually, we are in the Regulatory Policy Committee developing 3 sets of best practice principles. One for RIA, one for ex-post reviews, one for stakeholder engagement. And right now, literally 30 minutes ago, we have launched public consultations on 2 of them. One on RIA, one on ex-post. So if you go to our website, oe.cd/regpol, you will see links to these 2 consultations document. Obviously, you are more than welcome to send us comments. So very briefly, I will summarize what do we understand as good ex-ante reviews of regulation, good regulatory impact assessment. Well, first of all, good regulatory impact assessment should be done in cooperation with stakeholders. So all stakeholders should have a right to express their views. All stakeholders should be engaged in the process continuously, not just at the end. Every good ex-ante evaluation should start with problem definition. which in many countries is a big issue. The problem definition, as you all know, should be smart, specific, measurable, etc. Usually the definition is rather vague. We want to improve the environment, quality of air, or we want to adopt a law. So it's actually objective like a cycle. We are adopting a law because we want to adopt a law. So you need to set a clear objective that is measurable, that will make it easier later on to evaluate the effects of regulation. You should describe the regulatory proposal, so what is being done there, and then you should try to identify alternative solutions. I will stop there for a second because these solutions are both regulatory and non-regulatory ones, and one of them is also do-nothing option. And again, this is a huge issue in many countries. Usually there are three options. One of them is not to do anything, and the other two are very similar. And when Janine mentioned in the morning that regulators should be allowed to think out of the box, I think they should be actually forced to think out of the box, because sometimes it's really comfortable to stay, in your comfort zone, in your comfort box, and not to think outside the box. And then obviously all these options should be analyzed from the perspective of costs and benefits, and we are always stressing that all costs and benefits should be analyzed, not just the impacts on businesses, but it should be about social impacts, environmental impacts, etc., impacts on innovation, for example, you name it. And then last but not least, civil servants, government should identify the preferred solution and justify why this solution has been chosen. So this is the ideal process. Does it work like this in any of the OECD countries, 100%? The answer is no, it doesn't. Does that mean we should get rid of RIA? Well, I don't think so, but let's talk about this later. When we talk about ex-post evaluations, again, we are developing best practice principles. So here you have just brief summary of what we are saying in the best practice principles. They should be obviously evidence-based. They should focus on the actual outcomes of regulations, so they should measure performance of regulations. In fact, they should be made an integral part of the regulatory cycle. So before you start regulating, you should actually analyze what already is in place, what already exists. Maybe you can use the existing regulations. Maybe you can enforce them better. Then you should have a proper system of governance, so you should have some kind of a regulatory oversight body involved in overseeing the quality of ex-post reviews. You should have units in particular departments and ministries, etc. You have a big portfolio of approaches. We don't have time to go through all of them, so if you are interested, again, go to our website and look at the document. But basically, as part of all ex-post reviews of regulations, you should answer these critical questions. So, is the measure adopted appropriate? Does it really lead to the intended goal? Is it effective? Is it efficient? Doesn't it cause unnecessary burdens for citizens' impacts or the public sector, or there are any feasible alternatives that you could maybe use to better achieve the goal. And then you have a lot of methodologies that you should use. Again, you should always engage stakeholders in the process. They are the ones who actually know how things work in practice, how things work in real life. Obviously, as in every case, there needs to be some capacity building and committed leadership to make this work. Again, does this work in any OECD country properly? The answer is, again, no, it doesn't. 100%, none of the OECD countries is perfect. Let's be honest about that. So now the question is, if these things don't work, should we get rid of them? Should we maybe modify them slightly? Should we make them better? Should we implement them better? Should we make them work, actually? It's always difficult to speak after Andrea Renda, actually, and I've known Andrea for quite some time, and I have a lot of respect for him, and we share this enthusiasm for good regulation and technologies as well. But when I watched his presentation, because we got it approximately a week ago, I was thinking, what am I going to add? What am I going to talk about here? And then one morning I looked into a mirror and I thought, you're getting old, actually. Celine, that was your cue. Now you were supposed to say, it's not that bad. No. Never mind. So maybe, and all your life, you have been considered as someone, trying to change things. Maybe it's time to become conservative. And by that, I don't mean, these alt-right neocons. No. I mean, a guy in a suit, having a glass of whiskey or cognac or cigar. Maybe not these two guys exactly, but actually these days, it's almost revolutionary to be conservative. Here's a couple of reasons for why I think some of us at least should stay conservative. We are not there yet. We are still far from artificial intelligence drafting secondary regulations. We are still far from having 5G networks, for example. Despite all the hype in the media, there is still a little bit of time to think. We don't need to rush into things. And yet, we have been there for quite some time. We are talking about big data and how much data is there available. But when you talk to ministries right now, they are complaining about the lack of data. They are not even able to use the data that have been there for ages. So you need first to change their approach, to change the culture, to be able to use the data that already exists. Shoveling data on them will not help. We need to change the processes. And it doesn't matter how much data is there in a public domain, in a way. In my life, I have seen too many revolutions, to be honest. So when I started, I was practically the only one being able to use internet in our department. And then we were telling people, ICTs will completely change their stakeholder engagement processes. We will be able to reach out to everybody in a remote village. 20 years later, the process has not changed qualitatively almost at all. Yes, we're getting more comments. Yes, we're putting everything on the internet, and then still we're hoping we won't get too many comments. But the approach has not changed too much. And then we had mobile phones, and we were thinking, yes, this will completely revolutionize the whole process because we can reach everyone's pocket. Still, we're not harnessing that. We're not using its full potential. So, is there a reason to think that this kind of a revolution will really change things? Regulatory management tools, as I said, have not been mostly used properly. What I mean by that, we are still not able to define a problem properly. We are still not able to think about different options. And I'll get back to it a little bit later, but when we're thinking about different options, we should think more about outcome-based regulations. We should think more about options for co-regulation. But we are not doing that, partially because we are not trained to do it, partially because no one asks us to do it. So we should really maybe get back to what already exists, which is regulatory impact assessment, and follow the procedure properly. Also, what is innovative? Let me tell you a story. I was once invited to a short one, don't worry. I was invited to a workshop on innovative solutions in the government. And then one lady was telling us about how they solved regulations of Uber in one of the Canadian provinces. I think it was Toronto, but I'm not 100% sure. So guess what they did? They thought about the problem they are trying to solve. Then they invited all stakeholders. They were thinking together about different solutions, thought about costs and benefits, and then they came up with a solution that was a compromise acceptable for everybody in the room. And I raised my head and I said, this is exactly what we have been preaching in the OECD for the last 20 years. So tell me, where's the innovation? The innovation is in the fact that they were actually doing it properly, not in the approach. I was almost carried out of the room for killing the mood, but I still believe that we don't need so many innovative approaches. We just need to do what we have properly. And then last but not least, how many sandboxes have you actually seen properly working? I've heard that word so many times during the last couple of days. But seeing some sandboxes actually working in practice remains still a challenge for me. Now, I kind of like the idea that we could test in cities, in one city, on one village, one kind of regulation. That might work with electric scooters, but with 99% of other stuff, this will probably not work. Also, maybe we should ask the people in that city if they would be happy with being an experimental city, and I'm not so sure about their answer. So I'm not, of course, I'm not against the idea of experimenting. I'm not against the idea of having sandboxes, but it's not a silver bullet. Being conservative does not mean we should not evolve and see opportunity. So maybe like these guys, we can roll out our sleeves, we can take off the tie, we can sometimes switch whiskey for beer. Still, we can learn, but we can still remain conservative. So these are my ideas, and some of them very briefly, because some of them copy what Andrea has said. Behavioral insights can be used more widely as a useful addition to what we already have. Close to where I live, in Paris, in Trocadero, they use behavioral insights. They put up posters thanking people for using a toilet instead of doing it in the bushes there. And the problem is that there are no toilets, so it's fantastic to use behavioral insights, but you need to first start doing things properly. So that's my idea of a useful addition. Then availability of data is there. I completely agree that the amount of data is almost crazy. But we really need to learn how to use them, and we need to be motivated to use these kind of data. There's a lot of opportunities for stakeholder engagement. I agree, we can reach out to zillions of people. We can use social networks. We can use artificial intelligence to actually analyze the input we get through stakeholder engagement procedures. But first, we need to change the mindset. We need to change the culture. We need to actually make the civil servants want to use the input. Otherwise, it will not work no matter what the technologies are. Again, we have a lot of options for different alternative solutions, outcome-based, performance-based regulations, but still they can work only in selected sectors. When we're regulating pipelines, for example, yes, this can work. In many other areas, this cannot work. We need to work more closely with stakeholders, again, on designing self-regulation or core regulation principles, but that really needs, again, changing the mindset, working with stakeholders. Don't be afraid of reaching out and talking to businesses, for example, because they have a lot of good ideas, in fact. So don't be afraid of getting in one room with users, producers, etc. We have a lot of opportunities for more regular, continuous monitoring. That's true. We can get a lot of data. We can improve our enforcement procedures. We heard these fantastic examples about using the data from Twitter for better enforcement of food safety regulations. I completely agree with that. This is something to be explored, and obviously I need to mention that because of the chair. International regulatory cooperation becomes more and more important because these things are global, and countries need to talk to each other. And finally, this gives us a good opportunity to close the loop, something we have been talking about for, again, 20 years. So using the information from ex-post evaluations to feed into the development process, regulation making process, and back again, and really closing the cycle. So my conclusions, I'm going to stop there, is regulatory management tools are actually more valid and needed than ever. They need to be fine-tuned. There's a need for better implementation, but I think there's a huge potential that still needs to be harnessed. We can add stuff, we can add innovation tests, we can add behavioral insights, but we shouldn't replace these techniques. So here's to you, innovators, but I will keep working on regulatory management tools. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. So now you see why we call him our guru. It's a mix of conservative and aspirational, a perfect one. And thank you as well for using an example for Canada, which is not about cannabis for once. So now back to the excellent panelists that we have to react to these two presentations. May I first turn to Professor Peterson? What is your take as a practitioner, as seeing regulatory impact assessment and evidence coming your way on this debate about the future of those tools for policymaking?
Thank you very much. I also have one slide. I have one slide, so was for that to come up. But until this, what Daniel told us about this best practices and the 0 to 6 amendments, or that's actually what we are trying to use and trying to get the regulators to use when we in the Norwegian Better Regulation Council are assessing their statements. But there is one difference, that we are limited to looking at how it affects business. And that was, you mentioned, and I agree, but we are limited, that there are also secondary effects back to businesses from the effects on citizens, on NGOs, and so that is a possible extension that could be evaluated. But my slides are focusing on 4, and after this morning's discussion, I will add a 5th. Things that we have seen after 3 years working with evaluating these suggestions for new regulation for the industry. And one is the significance criteria, because we often see that they are not assessing the cost benefit, not using the data as you said, and also that the lack of data is used as a reason for not trying to look at cost benefits, neither of them. And I think it's important as a message that you should assess it even if you don't have the accurate data. You can have lots of information out there. You can ask the industry, you can ask the stakeholders, and get some feeling. It doesn't have to be on the last digit correct. It is the spectre. Is it really seems to be a higher benefit than a cost on this? And there are lots of data there. It may be costly to use it in detail, but to use them as a way of assessing is important. But data is not enough, and as we have heard also, it's analysis. How do you use the data? How do you analyze them? And not necessarily only cost-benefit directly, but also the wider aspects. And it was very interesting this morning to hear that especially from Anita, but also the others, that you can use the data to have for simulations using artificial intelligence and other statistical and modeling methods, and to really get deeper into what are the potential effects. And you can also use that for existing regulations, and when you are considering to adjust it. So my main message here, after having looked at regulation, new regulation for 3 years, is that lack of data, or that you don't use have the ability to use the data or the possibility to use the data and analyze, you should assess the costs and benefits even so. The next one is that it seems, and that has also been pointed out by many, that sort of the one part of the government doesn't know what the other one is doing, and as when you sit there, well, I'm not in business, I'm at the university, but when the businesses sit there, they get all these different kinds of regulations. So it's a closer cooperation across government to assess the burden and to see whether the body of different regulation are efficient is what I would have liked to see much more of. There is a question in our program on the ex post evaluation and whether there is a problem that ex ante and ex post evaluations are getting more blurred. And I think my personal answer is it's a good thing. Because you should have the ex post evaluation of the last or the current regulation influence the ex ante evaluation of the changes, or if there is a new element, that the ex post evaluation of some similar regulation should be used in the ex ante. So I think they should be blurred. You should use all the knowledge on evaluation when you assess new suggested regulations. Then these two are more, well, important but technical. But I think the third one, stronger focus on behavioral aspects. And that was what I thought of in my questions to the former on competition. It's what are the incentives that is sort of provoked or applied to with the new regulation? Because the firms and people react differently from what the regulators are expecting them to do when they get a new regulation. So we need to look at what are the incentives that are induced, and how can we make the regulation take care of and support and nudge people in the right direction. So I think that is very important. And Andrea also mentioned it, and I think that is very important that we sort of switch, or at least add on to the evaluation, the incentives that is induced by the regulation. Then, as I announced, I have one additional, which is not on my slide, but has been mentioned by Daniel, I think, that you should regulate the results and not how people and how business work, to cater for changes in technology and to innovations. And we need to be much better in regulating and setting requirements to what should be the results. What should be the result for environment, for labor force, and one example, for example, my topic in research, it's not regulation, it's international trade and shipping, which is of course international, and we need international regulations. And we have one which is on the environmental thing, sulfur content in fuel. Well, that's a typical regulation of the technology or the fuel you use. What should be? It should be the emission, the sulfur content in the emission. So that's one example. And then the last one, the yellow thing, is really not in what we are going to discuss in this session, but I would like to point it out because it's interesting to see how the political play, how stakeholders can use critical statements from the Norwegian Better Regulation Council, and it should be not NBCR, it should be NBRC. And when I teach for my students, I always say, there is always one misprint in my slides. Find it. Here it is. and how we can sort of be sure that our statements are not taken into the discussion on the political problem as such, because what we are putting into a statement when we criticize is the quality of the suggestion and the analysis, not whether we are against or for or whatever we mean on about the problem. And that sets some requirements on how do a council like ours present our assessments and statements. So I think that finalizes my comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Peterson. A lot of the challenges that you mentioned resonate very well with what we've seen happening in many OECD countries, and it really begs the question of how do we take the impact assessment ex post evaluation forward if we don't even manage to achieve the goalpost of today's ex post and RIAs. Turning now to you, Philip. I mean, the UK has a long-standing experience with scrutinizing its impact assessment. The RPC has been doing that for a long time. So what is coming next for you to follow the trend and catch up with the reality of life.
Thank you very much, Celine. Against our initial idea, I will actually use a few slides of the few slides I have just to back a few arguments I'm going to make. I actually wanted to make big punches here today in terms of telling the obvious. Now Daniel has just actually done that, which is a bit unfortunate because one of my three key messages today is essentially to actually focus on these things that we know are best practice. Because even in the UK, where we have a regulatory system that is quite advanced and that has quite a long standing history, we don't implement fully all these components that are considered best practice as best practice worldwide. And that starts, for example, and I'm talking here from the perspective of a regulatory scrutiny body, so the body that ensures the enforcement of the principles and mechanisms that are in place. That starts with consultation stage IAs, or what we call IAs, so RIAs. And on the other hand, at the end of the regulatory cycle, monitoring and evaluation plans. And we see very often in the regulatory proposals that these are not fully in place, and that because of time reasons or whatever sort of lack of resources, these are not properly laid out, and hence will actually put a risk at the effectiveness of a certain regulation. A second piece is about, and I've just heard that in a conversation with our German colleagues last week in a different format in Record Europe, the sort of informal network we scrutiny bodies work together, is that in German regulatory proposals, there's often just one policy option. And we see that even in the UK, that it's not standard that we have a set of policy options that are assessed before implementation. And that, I think, is also putting a risk at sort of the effectiveness of what comes out at the very end. In an interesting conversation we had, my Slovak colleague who's sitting in the back, last week as well, we talked about proportionality, and that speaking again from the UK's perspective, where there are the HR resources needed to assess impacts and scrutinize them, but there's many small countries, many small OECD member states that don't have these resources, and where we need to really strike the balance between, at the one hand, assessing regulatory impacts, and on the other hand, especially in view of the challenges that come from innovation and transforming technologies, that there is a cascade of requirements to policymakers when they assess and scrutinize regulatory changes. And at the very end, and that is not surprising, but I think it's quintessential in order to really close the system and ensure it's effective, there must be regulatory scrutiny, and I would even go as far as there must be independent regulatory scrutiny in order to make the system actually credible and effective, and to ensure there is enforcement of the principles that everyone at least formally commits to. And what do we mean with independent? Because that is obviously something that is very widely interpreted. In our understanding, this is the freedom from political interference. Hence, there must be a way where independent experts look at regulatory proposals in order to ensure that the evidence and analysis that is required is in place. Now, these are things that Daniel has spoken about. So this is nothing new. This is the obvious, and this is also the main key sort of argument I'm making. The two new things, or the two not so obvious things, are at the one hand what we call small and micro business assessments. SAMBAS is a very nice name in the UK, and that is a very common pattern for all OECD member states. We see that small and micro businesses are one of the key origins of innovation and the starting point for innovative technologies. And on the other hand, we also see that obviously these are, because of their size and because of the lack of resources they usually have, they suffer the most from regulatory burden or from compliance needs. And I back that with with a little slide here. We see on the second line, we've asked, or the ONS, the National Statistics Office of the UK, has asked small and micro businesses, what are the key challenges you're actually facing? And unsurprisingly, this is on the second rank, regulations. So when we talk about innovation and we talk about those who, at the one hand, are the starting point for it and for emerging technologies, we really need to ensure that the regulatory burden for them is as small as possible. And in the UK, our key approach, especially from a scrutiny point of view, is these SAMBA, small and micro business assessments, where we ask policy makers to assess what kind of mitigations can be developed in order to reduce the burden that is on small and micro businesses, in order to ensure that the overall burden at the end, the compliance costs, are as small as possible. And without going into much details, because we can provide that presentation at the, for everyone at the end, there is a set of mitigations, and this may seem very technical, but actually it ensures that those concerned by regulatory burdens are exempted either fully or partially, or at least for a transitional period. And there's other ways, for example, financial aid in exchange for to reimburse compliance costs these SMBs have, or schemes like opt-in and voluntary schemes. And that set of mitigating options is now a quintessential criteria in our work of scrutinizing impacts set out by policymakers in regulatory changes. The last, and this is something very new, and I need to flag that early, because I don't want that there's a misunderstanding. We are at a very early stage of thinking and developing. This is what we've been temporarily calling innovation tests. And again, from a scrutiny perspective, this will be mostly about what kind of consideration policymakers have for innovation in general when they draft impact assessments. And our early thinking here is around how can, on the one hand, SMBs, but on the other hand, businesses in general, be enabled to ensure or to be the starting point for innovation, and how can impact assessments be designed in a way that we assess that very thoroughly. And that starts with questions like, does the regulation that is set out here hinder or enable innovation? That looks at the two key principles that we've identified. On the one hand, adaptability, so whether over time there is enough regular scrutiny and enough regular review of the impacts of a specific piece of regulation. And on the other hand, flexibility. Do we give enough scope to those that will have to comply with the regulations that we implement? I already mentioned the mitigations, and again here this is very much specifically for SMBs. So what kind of mitigation options can we provide in response to obstacles to innovation? And lastly, and this is, I think, is quite an interesting, even a small detail, is there a way, and this responds very specifically also to one of the questions, namely, do we continuously, or is there a blurring effect sort of between ex ante and ex post review? And obviously, I think we always need to think very holistically here. We need to ensure that the whole cycle works. But in this case, we are currently thinking around how can we trigger ex post reviews on an irregular basis, namely when, for example, market conditions change, or when there's changes sort of to the kind of transformatory technologies that we see, in order to make sure that we don't just review every 5 years or every 20 years, but when it's actually needed and when the market imposes these kind of challenges. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Philippe. So now we have a bit of time to open the floor for questions and for the discussion. We welcome questions to the panelists, obviously, but also input in terms of whether in your experience you've seen new developments in the area of regulatory impact assessment or ex-post evaluation, and you think those are good developments for addressing the challenges of these new technologies. So, for example, Philippe mentioned the innovation impact test as part of the impact assessment, and we know it's been adopted in a number of countries. Do you have result from using that? Is it working the way you want it to work, or do you have other examples of practices that have been very helpful for regulators to address the challenges of new technologies? So do we have volunteers for inputs, questions? Ruth?
Thank you. Ruth Harries from the Better Regulation Executive in the UK. And thank you to the panel for a very stimulating and quite entertaining discussion at times. I wanted to ask quite a specific question, actually picking up on one of the points that you said, Daniel, about the counterfactual. Because I think in this context where we're looking at very fast-paced changing environments, actually the more accurate we can get our counterfactual, or perhaps different scenarios under the counterfactual, the more relevant that is to assessing what the best policy option is. But it's something that perhaps doesn't always receive quite the attention that it ought. And I wondered whether the panel had any reflections on the best way to improve our counterfactuals to help address that issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. We have a second question with Nick. Is there anyone else? So I see Suzanne. Okay, Suzanne.
Thank you for the interesting presentations, and I was especially triggered by the presentation of Daniel, because I agree that we should be conservative in such a way that we should continue thinking about how to implement the things we have developed. And this takes a lot of time. This is one of my experiences in regulatory policy, that it takes a lot of time, that you have to look at the developments and make sure that you align with these developments in trying to have the interests of parties to use the instruments, because I don't think these instruments are bad, or that it should have all kinds of new developments. But having said that, what I really face as a problem in the Netherlands at least is that we have developed all these instruments, and we gradually use these instruments more often and better. But then again, this goes two ways, because on the one hand, everyone is complaining about using the instruments, especially for the civil servants, but also the politicians. And on the other hand, people are adding all kinds of quality demands to the impact assessments and all kinds of process steps, which make sure that we have to do more and more. And then it's we end up probably only complaining that it's not doable anymore. So maybe the panel members can get into this constant struggle.
Thank you very much. I have on the list Ulrich and Nick. I propose to close after that and to go back to the panel, and then we will reopen. Ulrich, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Ulrich Mogensen. I'm from the European Commission. Thank you for very interesting and stimulating presentations. My question is about how actually to assess the impacts on innovation. I think that is not very straightforward, actually. I think it's complicated, and I think it should not just be an assessment of whether you put burdens on business or I mean, if you think about Michael Porter, he stressed the quality of demand and the challenges that demand can spur innovation in businesses for higher standards, for higher implementing better products, for innovation. And so I would like to see more about how actually to go about assessing impacts on innovation. We have in the European Commission, we have guidance on this, but it tends to be quite process-oriented. It's about asking questions, it's about involving stakeholders, it's about considering issues. But I don't think we have a real good formula for how to really assess impacts on innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick?
Hi, Nick Malishев again, and I think my question follows pretty closely onto Ulrich's. But first, but I think it's taken very much in the vein of Daniel's notion of conservatism, but I'd like to sort of call this maybe progressive conservatism in terms of like trying to progress on what we're doing. And it's in reference to this new innovation test in the UK, which I think is really good. I just read the white paper, and I think it's great to see a jurisdiction that's really trying to push the envelope in terms of using regulation and using regulatory management tools better. But, I was struck by a paper that the OECD wrote maybe even 10 years ago on innovation and regulation. And one of the things that it pointed to was the fact that some of these first principles around competition in markets and around red tape on business had a huge downward pressure on innovation. And I'm struck by the fact that many markets across OECD countries are becoming more concentrated right now, not less so. And I'm also struck by the fact that, I think regulatory regimes are still highly preferential on SMEs. And, and there is really good data that too much red tape really limits entrepreneurship, it limits firm creation. So in a way, are we getting a little bit ahead of ourselves? And how can we use the tools that we have in hand really to make certain that regulations are supporting more competitive markets? And really, are we certain that those regulations aren't being too difficult for SMEs to develop? And do we need to do that as well as trying to develop specific measures on innovation? And again, I'd be happy to hear from the room on that, because I don't mean to direct it just at the UK here.
Well, thank you. Let's go back to the panelists, and then we'll open again the floor. Maybe let's start in inverse order. Philippe, do you want to start answering the questions you feel most comfortable with?
Yeah, without making this too UK specific, but I'm still speaking from the UK perspective, and in response to Nick and to our colleague from the Commission, we also struggle, obviously, or we have been struggling with the question: what does it actually mean to test innovation? And referring back to the slide I briefly displayed, some of the initial ideas we have at the moment are all around: do we provide enough space for those innovating, or are the compliance requirements so narrow that the space in which they operate, the space they have in order to do the kind of R&D they do in order to develop a certain product? And especially referring back to Nick, this applies very much to SMEs, SMBs. And on the other hand, whether we ensure that there's a system in place that is not very fixed, that is not very static, but that reviews the need to intervene differently on an ongoing basis. So to make a good example, we have technologies, especially in the digital space, that are so quickly developing that the typical format of ex ante and ex post reviews that goes on for many years in the UK. We have different requirements from 5 up to 20, 25 years and longer. That there needs to be a process in place where we are more flexible as policymakers and those reviewing impacts to say, because of the very rapid development a specific technology has done, and because of the need for us to ensure innovation is possible, we need to ensure that our system is much more flexible in terms of when do we review certain impacts. And that are two ideas that we're working on. So flexibility for those, flexibility and adaptability for those innovating.
Thank you.
Yeah, the most questions or comments were on innovation, and I think there are several things that need to be focused. One is the flexibility, that we are really making rules and regulations that are flexible and opening up for different ways of doing things, so that you can change the way of operating, change the technology you use without having to have the regulation changed. And that brings me to the regulation of outcomes and not of methods of working or technologies. And so that I think is one very sensible, a very essential thing to look into. How can the rules be formulated so that they open up for different ways of doing it? One of the comments commented on that entry that you should have, and that's important. Entry, facilitation of entry. Be sure that the regulation doesn't limit entry as such. Then you can set requirements to what those new firms are doing and how they are operating and the results of their, for example, the environmental results. But to facilitate entry, have that as one checkpoint, that is this regulation limiting entry in some ways that we didn't think of. And that, of course, part of entry is also competition, that you don't have big firms with market power to stop entry or to limit entry. So I think that's an essential, so I fully agree with, I think it's your comment on that. I've also come back to behavioral aspects and incentives. There is lots of research going on these topics, and I think regulators should be more aware of these results and this research. The research might be on pupils in school, but they look at how can you nudge people, how can you foresee in some ways what they are doing, and how can you also make rules that opens up for people to use their innovative abilities, but not being stopped by it. So I think that's essential to follow what is happening in research on behaviorism, behavioral aspects and incentives. For the discussion this morning, we had on patterns of data patterns, pictures, other kinds of data. And I think that is something we should look into. How can we use that to see, for example, comparing two industries where there's lots of innovation and where there's little innovation? Has that something to do with the regulation of these industries? And the way to find them would be to look at data patterns on innovative things coming up, new products, new ways of doing things. So I think that's also where our thing that the regulators and us assessing can look more into. My last comment would just be that I agree fully that we should look at small and medium-sized and micro businesses, but we shouldn't forget that quite a lot of innovations comes from part of the big firms. So Facebook has been named. They are doing lots of innovation, and also more traditional firms. So I agree on the SME focus, but we shouldn't forget that also other established firms can be very innovative. Thank you.
Daniel, you want to close the round?
Well, maybe let me first focus on the question from Suzanne from the Netherlands, because by accident I was in The Hague last week working on a mini review of the Dutch RIA system. And yes, I can completely agree. We were facing these arguments from the side of civil servants that RIA in the Netherlands works like a Christmas tree. New tests are being added. And that leads me to a question on the innovation principle being added on top of all the principles we have to look at. Maybe I will answer with a question, which we can then discuss during the breakout session number 1. A little bit of advertisement there. Aren't we making RIA too procedural by adding more and more tests? Shouldn't we stick to the basics? Thinking about social, environmental, and economic impacts, and really looking at the fact whether regulation at least supports competition, because that might lead to innovation. It does not really put disproportionate burdens on SMEs, because then if it doesn't, then it can lead to innovation. So adding more stuff and really adding different tests for gender equality, innovation, etc., will not actually help, will actually make it more difficult for civil servants that want to use RIA to comply with that. On the other hand, we need to also stimulate the demand for good quality analysis at the level of decision makers, policy makers, politicians. That is a question that I don't have an answer for. How do we do that? That's also a very critical question, especially during those days when politics are mostly based now, not mostly maybe, but more and more based on opinions and political preferences rather than evidence. And then it would be unfair not to at least try to answer Ruth's question about counterfactual, even though it's quite difficult and I don't have an answer for that. But my thinking would be we need to engage stakeholders more, to get input from them, so to ask them what would happen if, and then also use more scientific expertise. So use different think tanks, analytical units maybe in ministries to give us input for building a counterfactual. And maybe other panelists will have a view on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, there was a couple of questions that were raised by the panelists and by the audience that we may want to go back to in the breakout session of this afternoon. The due diligence question that you have, Suzanne, and the overburdening of the RIA process can be related also to the proportionality principle that Philip has mentioned. It's not only proportionality in terms of the size of the measure, but it's also in terms of the significance of the impacts that you look at in different sectors. So I hope we can go back to that. And if you have from the audience any feedback on that, or on the counterfactual, or on how the innovation principle and impact is working in your own jurisdiction, please, we still have 5 minutes before we go back to Janine for the wrap-up. Yes, Niels.
Hi, thank you. Niels Bergsten from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board in the European Commission. I wanted to give a quick comment on Professor Strand and his interventions. Also support Daniel's conservatism. There's a need to ensure that the innovations actually deliver net public benefits. Sometimes there's an expectation that, of course, innovation is always good. The only innovations that rise to the top deliver net public benefits. But we saw, for example, in financial markets, that's not the case. And it's important to keep an eye on what happens before somebody gets extremely rich and then there's a huge bill on the taxpayers. So just to keep that in mind, there's certain sectors where you could probably have more tolerance for making mistakes, and you can have more tolerance for trying out different things and see how they work out. I imagine you have a huge amount of tolerance for trying different things in fashion design, but when it comes to financial products, less so. If it comes to air transport, you really worry about having completely free entry and not having a tight regulation on this. And so, I wanted to support the conservatism there. Regarding the stakeholder views, it's very, very important always, of course, to listen to what people think. The people should express what they think, but too often we see that a stakeholder consultation then just treats whatever they found as if it were a vote on what should be done, when people don't really know what they're answering. They don't understand the context completely. It's input, and it shouldn't be taken as more than it actually is.
Thank you. A last intervention from the room. This is a unique opportunity for that panel. Look at the panelists on stage. No? So the panelists, do you want to say? We have one? Oh, sorry, Leila.
Yes, I'm Leila Kostiainen. I am here as the chair of RegWatch Europe, and I'm chair of Finnish Council also. First, thank you very much for the panel. It was very, very interesting. And also this discussion is very interesting. I also support the progressive conservatism from Daniel. It was very good that you was guiding us to the basics and to the roots. It's very important. Then one thing I would like to comment, Siri Pettersson's Strander's, when you had in your build there was, you said that stakeholders have used scrutinizing statements in support for the political opposition to suggested regulations. Yes, that happens. That happens, I think, in every country it happens. And it's the same in Finland too. But we have had this council and these statements for 3 years, as you have had in Norway too. And I think that it is a question of political debate, which is very important part of democracy. And that's why we don't have to try to stop it, this discussion. And we have to support the democracy and the political democracy also with impact assessments and the transparency which comes with it to the political situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to go back to the panelists in case you want to. You have a last word for the session, Professor?
Yes, to the last comment, I fully agree that it's part of the political debate, and that is an outcome that we would like to see. But still, we should be sure that we formulate our statements so that we are not taken as part of that political discussion, as a scrutiny board. So if we can have people react and use and engaged in the political debate, that's good. But it shouldn't be sort of arguing that since the scrutiny board is critical, this is a bad thing to do or this is a good thing to do. So that was my point. But on the political debate, I fully agree. There was also one comment on innovation, that not all innovations are good, and that's fully agree on that. But I think that it's difficult on beforehand to say what innovation that we sort of see coming is good and what is bad. So what we should focus on is to regulate the outcome, not only emissions to air, but also the outcome on competition, the outcome on consumer protection, and that I think takes care of your comment. If we look at the outcomes and regulate the outcomes, not the different methods and technologies, and have a sort of broad view of what are the outcomes that we allow. I don't say it's easy, but I think the focus should be that.
Thank you. Philippe, a last word?
Yeah, very much in connection to what Professor Sanders just said, and also what Niels Bergson just said earlier. I found it quite interesting that you mentioned transport, and I think in view of clean green growth, and on the other hand, what the professor just said in terms of we need to give space to technologies to emerge and develop. I think this is really a very tricky task for policymakers to allow enough space, and I mentioned that flexibility and adaptability earlier, while on the other hand to be ready, and that is the second component, to be able to intervene quickly where when you identify a certain risk from an emerging technology that is not in our favor or not in a collective interest. And I think this is something that we should explore much more in depth later at the breakout session.
Well, thank you very much. So Daniel is just told me that he's keeping the progressive conservatism as a subtitle for the best practice principles on RIA. Janine, are you now ready to wrap up the morning sessions? Thank you. Let me just thank the panelists for the good discussion that we had after coffee break, and welcome Janine for the wrap-up.
And thank you to the panel. So I have the unenviable task of trying to summarize in 2 minutes everything that we heard this morning. And we heard so much good stuff that it's not easy to summarize it all. But I think there was a theme, at least for me, that emerged between both panels. And I would invite you to think about this more, as we've said in the breakout sessions. And to me, that theme is this: whether we're talking about data, how to use it, how to regulate with it, how to protect it, or whether we're talking about regulatory management tools, we're talking about a lot of challenges and a lot of questions. And none of us quite know where to focus first. We all have a little bit of a different point of view on it, and we all have a little bit of a different question about it. But what I keep thinking as I'm listening to the panelists, either the panel that I was on earlier this morning or this one, is the only way we're going to come to solutions is if we do work together on this. Private sector has a view on data and has some methods and some abilities that we in government don't, but that doesn't mean that we can't sit down together and dialogue about these things and work together towards solutions. Regulatory management, we've heard a lot about the importance of we don't always have data, but when you don't, go out and ask for it, go out and collaborate, go out and work with stakeholders in new ways. So to me, a big part of what we're trying to figure out here in terms of regulating in a digital economy, we can't figure it out by ourselves as the OECD Regulatory Policy Committee and the regulatory oversight bodies in our individual jurisdictions. It's a collaborative effort, and it takes continued dialogue and continued sharing of best practices and working across national boundaries, but also working across sectoral boundaries to really get to the bottom of some of these. So think about that as you get into your workshops this afternoon, and think about the solutions that you can bring, that you can learn from others, or that you've heard brought by other stakeholder groups that aren't represented here today as you work through those three workshops. And that's the beauty of the MRP conference. At the RPC, we're all representing our country, and we're talking about really important issues from the point of view of our countries, but now you're rolling up your sleeves and you're going to work this afternoon, and you're going to get to tackle some of these really big issues. And I think you should really use that opportunity wisely. I've just been asked, if you'll indulge me for 2 more minutes, I've been asked by Chelsea to give you a little bit of an overview of how the rest of the day is going to work before I let you go for lunch. So the first thing is, you're not coming back here. You all know what workshop you're in because you've all signed up for a workshop, and you're invited to go directly at 2:30 to each of the breakout groups. So session 1 is taking place in room Huldra A. Session 2 is in boardroom 7 and 8, and session 3 will be in room Huldra B. I'm sorry about my pronunciation. French and English, that's what I'm able to do. So you know where you're going, and there's signs throughout, so please go to your breakout sessions directly at 2:30. The breakout sessions, all the moderators, you know who you are. The moderators are responsible for those sessions. They will be giving you a coffee break at their discretion. They will also be letting you go at 4:45. If you are like me and you wore high heels and you don't want to walk up to the ski jump in high heels, you will have 15 minutes to go change into flats, because at 5 o'clock we're meeting just out there for the commencement of the social events this evening. So at 5 p.m. we're all going to meet at the registration desk, and then I'm also told that once we go to the ski museum, we'll be coming back here for the rest of the evening, and there will be a family photo, because we're a big, happy regulatory policy family, at 7:15 p.m. So bring your smiles, come back here at 7:15, and then we'll continue with the social evening. And Chelsea, did I forget anything that people needed to know? Okay, Chelsea knows everything, really. She just writes it down for me. So thank you, everybody, for a productive morning. To both panels again, thank you. And now we're off to lunch 2 minutes early, and it's in the same place that we've had breakfast. So thank you, everyone.